Today we are going to talk about the food and agriculture, that how important that is for feeding the growing population. We will talk about that how many people are chronically hungry and why does hunger persist in a world of surplus? What are the different reasons? What are some health risks of undernourishment, poor diet or overeating? We'll talk about the primary food crops and the soil, what the soil means and what are the different components of soil. Also, we will be talking about the green revolution and the GMOs. The GMO means the genetically modified organisms, that includes all plants, animals or microorganisms. And what are the different characters or traits that are most commonly introduced with those GMOs, the genetically modified organisms. We will also see that to describe some environmental costs of learning and ways we can minimize these costs. There is a famous quote by Albert Einstein that we can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking that we used when we created them. That means that, for example, 100 years ago, there were some problems regarding the agriculture or food production. So we cannot solve those problems right now because right now we have the country, I mean, the world is overpopulated. So that means that we cannot solve those problems by the same kind of methods or techniques that we have been using 100 years ago. So we have to change our way of thinking and solving those problems. We have to adopt the new technologies in order to solve those problems. For example, the food problems or the food security. Let's start with a case study that is about farming the Cerrado. Soybean boom was sweeping across South America. Inexpensive land, availability of new crop varieties, and government policies favored the agricultural expansion that have made those South America the fastest growing agriculture area in the world. The center of this rapid expansion is the Cerrado, which is a huge area of grassland. You can see here the Cerrado. It's a huge area of grassland and tropical forest stretching from Bolivia and Paraguay across the center of Brazil, almost to the Atlantic Ocean. So biologically, we can say that this rolling expanse of grassland and tropical woodland is the richest savanna in the world, with at least 130,000 different plant and animal species. But in the past few decades, however, Brazilian farmers, they have learned that modern application of lime or phosphorus can increase the yield of soybean, maize, cotton, and other valuable crops. The researchers have developed more than 40 varieties of soya beans, mostly through conventional breeding, but some created with the molecular techniques like genetical engineering or other techniques. So specially adapted for the soils and climate of the Cerrado. So those genetically modified organisms or varieties that have been developed, they are specifically adapted for the soils and climate of this Cerrado region. Beef production has gone hand in hand with soybean production. The Brazil has long been an exporter of grass-fed beef from the countries, and agriculture ministers now aim in double that beef exports. So cleaning those pastures also makes the land available for sale to more soya operations, so that ranchers dramatically aid the transition from the forest to the crop field. It has been found that deforestation for cropland and pasture expansion is especially severe in the arc of destruction between the Cerrado and the Amazon. So this is called the arc of destruction. So this is an area between the Brazil and the Cerrado region, and uh, it's called the arc of distraction. So this is the Cerrado region, and these are the Amazon forests. So this is the area that's between those the Amazon and the Cerrado. So this is called the arc of distraction. So deforestation for cropland and pasture expansion is more severe in this arc of distraction. Farm workers displaced by mechanization, migration, they migrate to the cities or cut out new clearings in the retreating forest margin. So rapid growth of beef and soya production in Brazil have both positive and negative aspects. So on the one hand, more protein-rich food is available to feed the world, while as on the other hand, the rapid expansion and mechanization of agriculture has in the Brazil has led to the destruction of globally important biodiversity and creating those social conflicts. Talking about the global trends in food nutrition, the Brazilian agriculture represents one of the most dramatic cases of environmental change today. The Cerrado that we talked right before is a long way from Iowa and Illinois in the heart of US Corn Belt. But farmers in those states recognize the changes in soya fields of South America. Food production has been transformed from the small scale or diversified operations to vast operations of thousands of hectares, growing one or two genetically modified crops with abundant inputs of fuel and fertilizer for a competitive global market. So growing one or more those genetically modified crops, that means the genetically modified plants in which the genetic material like deoxyribose nucleic acid has been altered in a way that doesn't occur naturally by mating or natural combination. So the fact that why those genetically modified crops have been uh, modified, it means that these crops have been modified genetically to improve the yield of the crops and also so that they can adapt to the different soil and climatic conditions. So food production has increased dramatically that we now use edible corn and sugar to run our cars. We'll talk about that in detail in our chapter 13. According to the International Monetary Fund, 2005 global food costs were the lowest ever recorded. That means less than one quarter of the cost in the mid 1970s. So in United States and Europe, it has been found that overproduction has driven the prices low enough that we pay the farmers billions of dollars each year to take that land out of production. So despite these changes, the food costs have risen recently, which spells disaster for the poorest populations. Or in general, we can say that global food supply problems have more to do with distribution than with the supplies. Because we continue to produce the surplus, but hunger remains an urgent problem. So why is it so? That means the food production, we have a surplus food, but we are not distributing it evenly. In 1960, nearly 60% of people in developing countries were chronically undernourished, and the world's population was increasing by more than 2% every year. Food availability has increased in most of the countries to well over 2,200 kilocalories per person per day. So how the changes in the dietary energy and protein consumption they are related? We will talk about these. Changes in dietary energy you can see here is in the kilocalories and protein consumption here in selected regions. So North America and other developed regions consume more calories and protein that are needed. It has been found that food availability has increased in most countries to well over 2,200 kilocalories, the amount that generally considered necessary for a healthy and productive life. So protein intake has also increased in some countries, including the China and India, the two most populous countries. So less than 20% of people in developing countries now face chronic food shortages as compared to 60% just 50 years ago. But we can say that hunger is still with us. So changes in number and rate of malnourishment across the world. So this graph here shows us the how with the increasing years, the percentage of the number of people, the number of malnourished people is increasing across the world. This number is up slightly from a few years ago, but because of the population growth, the percentage of malnourished people is still falling. About 95% of hungry people are in developing countries. So hunger is especially serious in sub-Saharan Africa, like you can see here, the sub-Saharan Africa. So hunger is most likely there. So hunger is especially very serious in sub-Saharan Africa, a region that plagued by political instability. So increasingly we are coming to understand that food security or the ability to obtain sufficient healthy food on a day-to-day basis, which is a combined problem of economic, environmental, and social conditions. Even in wealthy countries such as United States, millions lack a sufficient healthy diet. The reasons for that might be poverty, job losses, lack of social services, and other factors that have led to the persistent hunger and even more persistent poor nutrition. Despite the fact that we have more cheaper food in terms of work needed to acquire it than almost any society in history. But still, we are facing this malnutrition, nourishment. What do we mean by food security? Food security is the ability to obtain the sufficient healthy food on a day-to-day basis, which is a combined problem of economic, environmental, and social conditions. Food security is important at multiple scales. In the poorest countries, it has been found that entire national economies can suffer from a severe drought, flood, or insect outbreak. So individual villages also suffer from a lack of food security. Sometimes we find that a bad crop year can devastate a family or a village, and local economies can collapse. So if farmers cannot produce enough to eat and sell, even with the families, there can be unequal food security. In some families, it has been found that, which is the male dominant family, the males often get both the largest share of the food and the most nutritious food, while the women and children who need food also, they are often get the poorest diet. So at least 6 million children under 5 years old die every year of diseases that are exaggerated by hunger or malnutrition. So providing a healthy diet might eliminate as much as 60% of the child deaths worldwide. Sometimes the displaced farmers often have no choice but they migrate to the already crowded slums of major cities when they lose their land. So famines can lead to long-term disruption as people are forced to eat their seed grain and slaughter their breeding livestock in a desperate attempt in order to keep themselves and their families alive. So that might be one of the reasons. Even when better conditions return, they have often sacrificed their productive capacity, and it will take a long time to recover from that. So famines often trigger mass migrations to the relief camps where people survive, but they cannot maintain a healthy and productive life. So here in this figure, you can see that hungry children in Somalia. So children are waiting for their uh, daily ration of food at a feeding station in Somalia. So when people are driven from their homes by hunger or war or some social systems, everything collapses. So diseases outbreak and the situation quickly becomes so desperate. As you can see in this figure, looking at their faces or their body structure, it seems that they have not been uh, getting the enough food or healthy food or nutritious food for a long time. So the reasons for that may be because they have been driven from their homes by hunger, or sometimes when there is a war or any other social systems that collapse everything, that collapse the system. And you can see that there might be some outbreak of diseases. So diseases spread rapidly and the situation, it becomes so desperate for them. Actually, how much food do we need? So this is a very good question. So a good diet is essential to keep you healthy. So a good diet means a diet full of vitamins, minerals, calcium, everything, proteins. You need the right nutrients as well as enough calories for a productive and energetic lifestyle. These shortages can result in devastating illness and death, as well as reduced mental capacity, developmental abnormalities, and stunted growth. That means if we don't get the right amount of food at right time with right nutrients or calories, proteins, vitamins, minerals, calcium, so it can result in the reduced mental capacity or some developmental abnormalities, or in some cases there might be stunted growth. United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, that means FAO, it estimates that nearly 3 billion people, that means almost half of the world's population, they suffer from vitamin, mineral or protein deficiencies. Here in this slide, you can see the dietary deficiencies that can cause the serious illness. So when we talk about the malnourishment, what malnourishment is? It is a general term for nutritional imbalances that are caused by lack of specific nutrients like vitamins, minerals, proteins, calcium, everything. So lack of protein in young children can cause kwashiorkor and marasmus that occurs when both protein and calories are lacking. Kwashiorkor is a West African word meaning displaced child. A young child is displaced and deprived of nutritious breast milk when a new baby is born. And when we talk about the marasmus, it's a word that comes from Greek that means to waste away. It's another severe condition in children who lack both protein and calories. A child suffering from severe marasmus is generally thin, as you can see here in this figure, and shriveled. So we can look at its body structure and you can say that this child, it suffers from marasmus. So it's the deficiency of both protein and calories. These conditions, they lower the resistance to disease and infections. That's why these children, they suffer permanent mental disabilities as well as physical development. In the other picture, you can see the swollen thyroid gland here. This is called the goiter. That means the iodine deficiencies can cause the goiter. So goiter is a disease that's caused by the iodine deficiency. It's a swelling of this thyroid gland. Iodine, we all know that it's essential for synthesis of thyroxine, which is an endocrine hormone that regulates the metabolism and brain development, among other things. Food and Agriculture Organization estimates that 740 million people, mostly in the Southeast Asia, suffer from this iodine deficiency, including about 177 million children whose development and growth have been stunted. That's why you can see that when we go to the grocery store to buy the salt, we see that there are certain kinds of salts, and in one you can see a salt that is the iodized salt. That means you can imagine that how important that iodine is in our body. So when we take that iodized salt, so that's a table salt that we usually use in everything. So that means we are trying to keep ourselves away from this goiter disease. So you can say that how important, you can see that how important this uh, salt is in our body. In this slide, you can see there is a Harvard food pyramid. You can see here. So it starts with a daily exercise and weight control, followed by the whole grains, the healthy habits, the vegetables and fruits, and also some amount of fish, poultry and eggs, nuts, seeds, beans, and then some amount of dairy, about 1 to 2 servings a day, or vitamin D, calcium supplements. And at the end, we can use some sparingly red meat, that's the processed meat, and butter. So that will be in very minute quantities. So this is called the Harvard food pyramid. The best way to stay healthy is to eat lots and lots of vegetables and grains, the moderate amounts of eggs and dairy products, and then this very less amounts, or we can say the sparing amounts of meat, oils, and processed food. So a solid base of this regular exercise, it underpins an ideal diet that is outlined by the Harvard dietitians. So modest amounts of fats, they are essential for healthy skin, cell function, and metabolism, but your body is not designed to process those excessive amounts of fats. So unsaturated plant-based oils such as olive oil are mostly recommended by the dietitians. Trans fats that are found in the hydrogenated margarine, they are not recommended as a healthy diet. Overeating is also a growing world problem. For the first time in history, there are probably more overweight people. That means more than 1 billion than underweight people. Underweight people are mostly 850 million. So being overweight increases your risk of hypertension, diabetes, heart attacks, stroke. You can get gallbladder diseases, osteoarthritis, respiratory problems, and some cancers. It has been found that every year about 400,000 people in United States, they die from illness that's related to obesity. This number is approaching the number that is close to the people that die because of smoking. So you can imagine that how the overeating is a growing world problem. Paradoxically, we can say that food insecurity and poverty can contribute to obesity. In one study, it has been found that more than half of the women who reported not having enough to eat, they were overweight. compared to the one third of food secured women. So, what could be the reasons for those women who reported that they don't have enough to eat? So, maybe a lack of time for cooking because they are always working, so they don't have time to cook and they just use the processed foods, whatever they get, and they eat. They are not health conscious. Or the other reason might be the limited access to healthy food choices, like I already said, and also the ready availability of fast food, snacks, and calorie laden soft drinks. So they just go, they don't have enough time to cook, and they just go to the grocery store and buy those processed foods, food snacks, or the soft drinks that often lead to that dangerous dietary imbalances for many people. So we can say that more production doesn't necessarily reduce the hunger. Most strategies for reducing the world hunger have to do with increasing efficiency of farm production, expanding the use of fertilizers or improved seeds, and converting more unused land or forest to agriculture. But the prevalence of obesity and unstable farm economies that suggest that lack of food supply is not necessarily the principal cause of world hunger. Or we can say the overabundance of food supplies in much of the world suggests that answer to global hunger may lie in we can use those commodities in a better way and distribute those food resources. So far, most of the farmers in the developed world, overproduction constantly threatens prices for farm products. Or we can say to reduce those food supplies and stabilize the prices in the United States, Canada, and Europe, we send millions of tons of food aid to developing areas every year. And it has been also found that the most of the food that has been produced is spoiled in storage or transit during the transport and is used inefficiently or sometimes thrown away. The food that we make a lots of food and then we throw it away. We don't eat that and throw away after preparation. We also prefer the inefficient foods, particularly meats that require about 4 to 10 times animal feed as is produced in meat. So if we just quit the meat, we will just follow the principle that we will eat meat just once a day, once a week. So that might uh, reduce this hunger among the growing population. Biofuels have also boosted the commodity prices. So prices they have declined again after 2008, but they were increased by an additional change, a new policy in United States and Europe promoting those biofuels. The biofuels means using those crops such as soya, corn, palm oil, or sugarcane to drive our cars, which is an important strategy for supporting farm economies in wealthy countries. So these new policies, they have also led to global increased production of these crops. In the United States, the federal ethanol subsidies led to a doubling of corn prices in 2007, but in developing countries, the production of soya, palm oil, or other products for export often displaces those food production. So when these biofuel policies they compete with the food supplies in Asia and Africa, the efficiency of this market becomes less clear. So do we have enough farmland? We probably do have enough farmland to feed more people than currently live on the earth, especially according to the recommendations that we already discussed. And we use all farm products for food rather than fuel and livestock feed. We can expand our production further by clearing new farmlands. Is it possible? So much of the world's uncultivated land could potentially be converted to cropland, but this land currently provides the essential ecological services. on which the farmers depend. So wetlands, for example, they regulate the water supplies, and forests and grasslands, they support the insect pollinators that ensure the productive crops. Forested watersheds, they help to maintain the stream flow, regulate the climate, and provide refuge for biological and cultural diversity. So these are the major three dominant crops, that's the corn, soybean, and wheat in the USA. So you can see here that the million metric tons is the production of these three main dominant crops in US. That's the corn, soya, and wheat. So you can see the corn production has been increasing drastically. Rising meat production is a sign of wealth. In developing countries, meat consumption has risen from just 10 kg per person per year in the 1960s to over 26 kg. So in United States, our meat consumption has risen from 90 kg to 136 kg per person. So you can imagine that how the rising meat production, how the meat production is rising in our countries. Dairy products, they are also a key protein source, so they consume more than twice dairy as meat, but dairy production has declined slightly while global meat production has more than doubled in the past 50 years. Meat, which is a good indicator of wealth but because it's expensive to produce in terms of resources that are needed. As discussed in chapter second, the herbivores use most of the energy they consume in growing muscles and bone, moving around, staying warm, and metabolizing the food. So only a little food energy is stored for consumption by the carnivores at the next level of food pyramid. So for every 1 kg of beef, a steer consumes over 8 kg of grain. So that that's just to give you an idea that how we can improve, we can feed the growing population if we quit eating the meat or we decrease our consumption of meat, because it has been found that 1 kg of beef that we eat, it consumes our 8 kg of grain, so that can feed a lot population. It has been found that meat and dairy consumption has at least become 4 times in the past 40 years, and China represents about 40% of the increased demand. This is just to give you an idea that number of kilograms of grain that are needed to produce the 1 kg of bread or 1 kg live weight gain. Talking about the confined animal feeding operations, that's the CAFO. It's a number of technological and breeding innovations have made increased production possible. One of the most important is this confined animal feeding operations. Animals are housed and fed mainly the soya and corn for rapid growth. These operations, they dominate the livestock raising in the US, Europe, and increasingly in China and other countries. The animals are housed in the giant enclosures with up to 10,000 hogs or a million chickens in an enormous barn or 100,000 cattle in a feedlot. So the main aim of this confined animal feeding operation is that the operators feed the animals specifically mixes of corn, soya, and animal protein. That's the parts of the animals that cannot be sold for human food, that maximizes their growth rate. There has been new breeds of livestock that have been developed that produce the muscle rapidly rather than simply getting fat. The turnaround time is getting shorter too. A US chicken producer can turn baby chicks into chicken nuggets after just 8 weeks of growth. It's possible because of these confined animal feeding operations. Steers, they can reach the full size by about 18 months of age. Also, the increased use of antibiotics, which are mixed in these daily feeds, makes it possible to raise large number of animals in the close quarters. About 90% of US hogs they receive these antibiotics in their feed. In this figure, you can see the confined animal feeding operations that have expanded the global market for corn and soya bean because they are mostly fed those two diets. Brazil's soya production has grown from near zero to being the country's dominant agriculture production. This figure here shows the confined animal feeding operations in the United States. That means the most livestock that are grown in the United States are raised in large-scale, concentrated animal feeding operations. Up to 1 million animals can be held in a single facility. So high population densities, they require heavy use of antibiotics and can cause severe local air and water pollution. Seafood, both wild and farmed, they depend on the wild source inputs. Recently, 13 of the 17 major marine fisheries have declined dramatically or become commercially unsustainable. It has been found that aquaculture is providing an increased share of the world's seafood. Fish can be grown in the farm ponds that take relatively little space but are highly productive. For cultivation of plant-eating fish such as tilapia, these systems can be very sustainable. Cultivation of high-value carnivore species such as salmon, however, it threatens the wild fish populations which are caught to feed those captive fish. In 2012, a study was carried out about the fish that catches for fish farms has shown that global declines of seabird populations such as puffins and albatrosses, it closely tracks the increase in farm-raised carnivorous fish. We can say that fish farms they produce much of our seafood, but most rely on the wild caught fish for feed, and pollution and diseases are the common concerns. Also, the biohazards that arise in industrial production, increasingly efficient production has a variety of uh, unaccounted costs. For example, land conversion from forest to grassland, to forest or the grasslands to crop fields increases the soil erosion, which degrades the water quality, and bacteria in the manure in the feedlots or liquid waste in manure storage tanks around the hog farms. It can escape into the environment from airborne fecal dust around the feedlots. It has been found that when the Hurricane Floyd hit the North Carolina coastal hog production region in 1999, some 10 million of hog and poultry waste overflowed into the local rivers, creating a dead zone in Pamlico Sound. While this was an especially very severe disaster, small spills and leaks to groundwater are also widespread. Also, we can say that constant use of those antibiotic resistant antibiotics has been associated with antibiotic resistant infections in hog producing areas. Now let's move to the other part of our chapter, that's the soil. We will talk about that what soil is and what are the different components of soil, and how we are adopting different technologies in order to improve our agriculture production. So what actually soil is, it's a complex community of bacteria and fungi that are responsible for providing the nutrients that plants need to grow. So when we put a seed in the soil, that means we are just waiting for that seed to become a full-fledged plant. And where does that plant get the nutrients from? So it's from the soil. So soil can be considered as a living ecosystem because it has all the biological community, the bacteria and fungi in it. Building a few millimeters of soil can take a few years to a few thousand years. Soil contains the mineral grains that are weathered from the rocks, partially decomposed organic molecules. It can be considered a living ecosystem by itself. Like I said, that it has all the biological, that's the communities, that's the bacteria, fungi in it. So carefully managed soil is a renewable source. Like we already discussed, that few millimeter of soil can take anything from a few years to a few thousand years to build. With careful husbandry and uh, that prevents the erosion and adds organic material, soil can be replenished and renewed indefinitely. You can see here in this figure that terracing, as in the Balinese or rice paddies, can control the erosion and make those steep hillsides productive. These terraced rice paddies have produced 2 or 3 crops a year for centuries because the soils are carefully managed and organic nutrients are maintained. So soil is a complex mixture of 6 components. Sand and gravel is the first component, that's the mineral particles from the bedrock, either in place or moved from elsewhere, as in the wind blown sand. And second is the silt and clays. That's the extremely small mineral particles. Many clays are sticky and hold the water because of their flat surfaces and ionic charges, and others also give red color to the soil. Third one is the dead organic material. That's the decaying plant matter that stores those nutrients and gives soil a black or brown color. The fourth one is the soil fauna and flora. That's the living organisms, including the soil bacteria, the worms, fungi, roots of the plants, and insects. And they also recycle those organic compounds and nutrients. Fifth component of soil is the water. That's the moisture from rainfall or groundwater, which is essential for those soil fauna and plants. And the last is the air. That's the soil air. That means the tiny pockets of air that help those soil bacteria and other organisms to survive. Healthy soil fauna can determine the soil fertility. That means the soil ecosystem, which includes those countless organisms that consume and decompose that organic material. They aerate the soil, they distribute those nutrients through the soil. So these fauna, everything, like it includes the worms, the bacteria, the fungi. We have some pseudozooption there, some snails you can see. So these are the slugs. So they are all the communities, the soil community that live in the soil. And this community or this ecosystem that's present in the soil, they actually consume and decompose that organic material and also aerate the soil, keep the soil fresh, and distribute those nutrients through the soil. This is a sample soil profile showing the common horizons. There is a O horizon, that's the organic layer, and soils vary greatly in composition and thickness of those layers. O horizon is the organic layer that's composed of decomposing leaves and organics. The topsoil, the A layer, the organic matter, organisms, roots, and inorganic minerals. And then we have the alluviated one, that's the washed out layer, which is composed of clays and humic acids that are leached to the lower layers from this horizon. So this is called the alluviated layer. Subsoil, we have the B horizon, which is enriched in clays and other material that has leached from this upper layers. So this one we can see that this is the alluviated layer, ILLUVIATED. That's the alluviated one. That means whatever has alluviated, whatever has been washed out from this alluviated layer, it is absorbed in this B layer. So this we can call as the alluviated layer. Why we use and abuse the soil? So agriculture both causes and suffers from environmental degradation. The Internal Soil Reference and Information Center in Netherlands estimates that every year the 3 million hectares of cropland are made useless by erosion, and 4 million hectares are turned into deserts, and 8 million are converted to non-agricultural uses like we are building the homes, highways, shopping centers, factories, or reservoirs. So water and wind erosion can cause a majority of global soil degradation. Chemical degradation, which is a secondary cause of soil degradation, it includes the nutrient depletion, salt accumulation, acidification, and also the pollution. How water is the leading cause of soil loss? There are different kinds of erosions that have been caused due to the water. So erosion is an important natural process that redistributes the products of geological weathering. Cattle and other livestock, they often accelerate the stream bank erosion as they trample and gaze down the vegetation that holds the bank in place. Erosion is of different kinds. One is the sheet erosion, the second one is rill erosion, the third one is gully erosion, and the fourth one is stream bank erosion that's caused by the cattle and the livestock because they have been grazing on the vegetation that holds that bank in place. Gully erosion occurs when the rills expand to form bigger channels or ravines. The rill erosion occurs when small rivulets of running water they cut small channels in the soil. And sheet erosion is like it removes a thin layer of soil. Sheet and rill erosion they cause most soil loss on farmland even though this process is often too gradual to notice. So there has been a lot of studies in Iowa farm fields that have found areas with as much as like 50 metric tons of soil lost per hectare during winter and spring runoff. So more than 12 times the rate that was stated by state soil scientists. The loss represents just a few millimeters of soil over the whole surface of field, but repeated years of storms and spring runoff, they gradually sending Iowa's productive capacity downstream to the Gulf of Mexico. These are the types of the erosion. Number two is the wind, which is a close second in erosion. That's the wind erosion. Wind can equal or exceed water in erosive forces, especially in dry regions where the vegetation is very low. Deep plowing and heavy herbicide applications that create the weed-free fields that almost look tidy but are subjected to erosion. Farmers under pressure to maximize the yields they meet loan obligations, they often plow through grass-lined watercourses and pull out those windbreaks and fence rows to accommodate the large machines and to get every last square meter into production. So removing those windbreak trees or fence rows or grass-lined watercourses, that actually leads to the wind erosion. Or we can say that intensive farming practices, that means using those heavy machineries, are responsible for these wind erosions because they need a space for to accommodate those heavy machineries. Row crops They leave the exposed soil for much of the growing season, and heavy herbicide application. It creates the weed-free fields, but that might look tidy to some, but it is subjected to the erosion. Wind erosion can lead to desertification. Over the past 30 years, China has lost about 93,000 square kilometers, which is about the size of Indiana, to desertification. Every year, more than 1 million tons of sand and dust that blow from Chinese drylands, often traveling across the Pacific Ocean to the west coast of North America. But it has been found that since 1985, China has planted more than 40 billion trees in order to stabilize that soil and hold back those deserts. It has been found that globally the erosion by wind, that's the wind erosion, it accounts for about 28% of global cropland. Let's talk about the agriculture inputs. That means the different inputs on which the agriculture depends. Since soil is the foundation of food production, but there are many other critical factors also. That means the reliable water resources, nutrients, favorable temperatures and rainfall, productive crop varieties, the mechanical energy to tend and harvest the crops. Strategies for applying these different inputs, they vary greatly among regions, and it has been found that there are some contrasting farming strategies also in order to increase the agriculture input. When we talk about the high yields, it usually requires the irrigation. Some countries are water rich and can readily afford to irrigate the farmlands, while other countries are water poor and they must use water very carefully. In some places, there are high evaporative and seepage losses from unlined and uncovered canals that can mean that as much as 80% of water that has been withdrawn for irrigation never reaches its destination. There is a pivot irrigation system that has been used in US farm fields. You can see here. So main aim of this kind of irrigation is to see that these systems, they create the green circles in the landscape that you can see in these photos here. So that means the water is evenly distributed and the field is not over irrigated. So this pivot irrigation system is mostly used in the US farm fields nowadays. Excessive irrigation not only wastes the water but also often results in waterlogging or salinization. So waterlogging occurs when soil is saturated with water, and what happens is that the plant roots, they die because of the lack of oxygen. The anaerobic condition develops in the soil. That means because of waterlogging, because of excessive irrigation, a lot of water stagnates in the soil or it compacts the soil, making the soil anaerobic, and plant roots can die from lack of that oxygen. Sometimes the salinization may occur, which causes the mineral salts accumulate in the soil, which is a problem when irrigation water dissolves and mobilizes these salts. And when the water evaporates, it leaves that crust on the soil surface. And that is very lethal to most of the plants. Using a lots of fertilizers on the farm in order to increase the agriculture production. Nitrogen, which is a component of all living cells, is the most common limiting factor for plant growth. Phosphorus and potassium, they can also be limited in supply. So nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are our primary fertilizers. Much of the doubling in worldwide crop production has been found since 1950 has come from increased inorganic fertilizer use. Over-fertilizing is also a common problem. Phosphates and nitrates from the farm fields and cattle feedlots, they are a major cause of aquatic ecosystem pollution. So the excess fertilizers, they contaminate the drinking water and destabilize the aquatic ecosystem. The nitrogen levels in groundwater have risen to the dangerous levels. It has been found that this is possible because of the intensive farming practices. Young children are especially sensitive to the presence of those nitrates. Using nitrate contaminated water to mix those infant formula can be lethal or fatal for the newborns. The food system in the United States consumes about 16% of the total energy that we use. It has been found that after the crops that have been grown on the farm, they leave the farm, additional energy is used in food processing, in distribution, in storage. It has been estimated that average food item in the American diet travels 2,000 kilometers between the farm that grew it and the person who consumes it. For some foods, processing, storage, and distribution use even more energy than growing the crop. Also, the pesticide use continues to rise. There are concerns about the types and amounts of those pesticides that we use, but our reliance on them has grown steadily over the years. Pesticides are important to us, but indiscriminate use has serious effects. Chemical drifting or washing away from field endangered non-target species. One of the most urgent consequences of heavy reliance on pesticides has been the evolution of pesticide-resistant varieties of weeds and parasites. As we have already discussed in chapter 2, as species traits can shift if environmental conditions change. So in the presence of pesticides, sometimes a few tolerant individuals often survive and reproduce, and tolerance of the pesticide can become dominant in a population. We have some new pesticide tolerant varieties of weeds or parasites that can emerge because of the overuse of those pesticides. Around 400 different cases of pesticide resistant weed populations have been recorded by the Weed Science Society of America. So that means that overuse of those pesticides have many side effects because it's resulting in the pesticide resistant weed populations and also the pesticide tolerant species like the parasites or weeds that are tolerant to those pesticides. We have been using the techniques like spraying the pesticides by air, which is a quick and cheap, but sometimes the toxins they often drift to the nearby fields. How we have actually managed to feed the billions? In the developing countries, 95% of agriculture growth in 20th century came from improved crop varieties, that's the green revolution, or increased fertilization, irrigation, and pesticide use rather than from bringing new land into production. Green revolution has increased our yields. The major improvements in farm production have come from the technological advances and modification of a few well-known species. Yield increases often have been spectacular. A century ago, it was found that when all the maize in the United States was open pollinated, average yield was about 25 bushels per year. In 2009, the average yield from rain-fed fields in Iowa was 188. So you can imagine that how we are increasing the yields because of the green revolution. And it irrigated maize in Arizona averaged about 208. Norman Block has uh, come up with the semi-dwarf variety of wheat you can see here in the right, which has shorter, stiffer stems and is less likely to lodge or fall down when wet than its conventional cousin. That's the left one here. That's the conventional variety. The miracle wheat responds better to water and fertilizer and has played a vital role in feeding a growing human population. So Norman Bloch's production of this semi-dwarf variety has helped a lot in increasing that, in feeding a growing human population. Genetic engineering, like I already said, that the genetically modified organisms, they come up with entirely new genes and even new organisms, often called the transgenic organisms. So these genetically modified organisms, the plants or animals, what actually happens is that in these genetically modified organisms, the genetic material, that's the DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, has been altered in a way that doesn't occur naturally, even by mating or natural combination. But there are some proponents that predict dramatic benefits from this new technology, the genetic engineering. Research is now on that crops that resist drought, frost, or diseases. Other strains are being developed to tolerate the salty, waterlogged, or low nutrient soils, allowing the degraded or marginal farmland to become productive. All of these could be important for reducing the hunger in the developing countries. So adopting these technologies, the genetic engineering, and producing those genetically modified organisms, genetically modified crops, in order to thrive well in the salt conditions, to tolerate the salt in the waterlogged conditions, or the soils which have the low nutrient status. So these crops can help in reducing hunger in the developing countries. Growth of genetically engineered cotton, corn, and soybean in United States. So you can see here that this is the hybrid herbicide tolerant variety, the HT, and you can see the Bacillus thuringiens cotton. Here you can see the BT crops contain the insect killing proteins from the bacterium Bacillus thuringiensis. One question that arises is that, is genetic engineering safe? After all, proponents say that we have been moving those genes around for centuries through plant and animal breeding. The biotechnology may just be a more precise way of creating those organisms that normal those breeding procedures. So despite continuing debates, the direct effects of genetically modified foods on human health remain unclear. Official studies uh, have tended not to find clear effects on humans. Opponents of genetically modified crops argue that studies have been biased or incomplete. So the question is likely to be disputed for some time. So the greatest worry about these genetically modified organisms is the ecological effects if they escape and breed with those wild relatives. There are certain sustainable farming strategies that are the goals of sustainable agriculture or regenerative farming. Some alternative methods are developed through scientific research, and some others are discovered in traditional cultures or practices that are nearly forgotten in our mechanization and industrialization of agriculture. Soil conservation is very essential because agriculture is the area in which soil is most essential and most often lost through erosion. So conserving that soil is very important. That's why there is a lot of farming practices like the contour plowing or strip farming that has been adapted in order to conserve the soil. Terracing has been also adopted, which is shaping the land to create level shelves of earth to hold that water and soil in order to uh, decrease the water erosion and soil erosion. So these strip forming, contour flowing, or terracing has been adopted in order to conserve the soil. In strip farming, it includes the planting of different kinds of crops in alternate strips along the land contours that can also help to conserve the soil. No-till technique is also one of the conservation practices, that planting leaves, planting debris in the rows. It involves the drilling seeds through the debris from last year's crop. Here, the soybean grow through the corn mulch. So they have not removed this corn mulch here. So the seeds have been drilled through this debris. So not removing those debris, it keeps the weeds down, reduces the wind and water erosion, and keeps the moisture in the soil because the soil is not exposed to the sun. So no-till planting is also one of the techniques for the soil conservation. Low input sustainable agriculture can also benefit the people. Finding the way that they cannot or they don't want to compete with the factory farms, these folks are making money and staying in farming by returning to small scale or low input agriculture. They are not using, there is a minor family that operates a highly successful farm near the Minnesota. They are not using any synthetic chemicals on their farm. The cows are rotated every day between 45 pastures. Antibiotics are used only to fight the diseases. So milk and meat production from this operation are marketed through the co-ops. You can eat low on the food chain because there is a less energy involved in producing food from the plants rather than producing it from animals. So one way you can reduce your impact on the world's soil and water is to eat a little more greens, vegetables, and dairy, and a little less meat. This doesn't mean turning the vegetarian unless you choose to do so, but it means that reducing your level of protein and fat consumption could make a difference for the environment and for your health. Concluding this chapter, food production has grown faster than the human population, and the percentage of people that face this chronic hunger has declined. Increases in food production result from many innovations, like we talked about the Green Revolution and the development of genetically modified organisms through genetic engineering. These changes can bring about environmental problems such as soil erosion and water contamination from pesticide and fertilizer applications. The consumers can influence farm production by choosing what food they buy and where they buy it. That was all about today's lecture. Thank you.